Mr. President, this past weekend marked 61 years since President Lyndon B. Johnson delivered his "We Shall Overcome" speech to a joint session of Congress. Speaking from the House rostrum, in the wake of Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, President Johnson urged Congress to pass legislation that would secure, quote, "the full blessings of American life to all, regardless of color or creed." That Congress would heed his call. On August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. That bill, nearly a century after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, would finally outlaw discriminatory practices that erected unjust barriers to voting for African Americans, like literacy tests, poll taxes. It would open the ballot box in America to everyone. 6 decades later, another president would speak from that same rostrum, this time at his State of the Union address. And that president insisted that Congress passed a bill that would make it more difficult, would make it harder for eligible citizens to vote. How far we have fallen from Lyndon B. Johnson's noble goal. We have not overcome. With this SAVE Act, we are still trapped in bigotry. Earlier this week, at President Trump's request, the Senate began consideration of the Save America Act in a marathon debate session. Why? Because President Trump is throwing a temper tantrum, demanding that Congress pass his legislation and nothing else. I have long said in politics there is always a good reason and a real reason. The good reason the president touts when arguing in favor of his bill, that it supposedly puts safeguards to prevent voter fraud. Nobody wants to see voter fraud. That's a good reason, isn't it? But here's the truth. Federal law already prohibits citizens from voting in federal elections, non-citizens from voting in federal elections, and cases of non-citizens voting are extremely rare. In 2024, the Bipartisan Policy Center decided to figure out how frequently we encounter voter fraud in American elections. The Conservative Heritage Foundation election fraud database found in the period 1999 to 2023, 24 years, how many cases do you think they found of voter fraud? Incidents where non-citizens successfully cast ballots. Out of the millions and millions of votes that were cast, they found exactly 77 in a 24-year period. 77. Barely more than 3 per election cycle. And you say to yourself, where is the voter fraud that is leading the Republicans now to create new obstacles for voters to face if they want to register to vote? What's the real reason then, if there aren't only 77 cases of voter fraud in 24 years? I'll tell you, it's for MAGA Republicans to cling to power by rigging the elections in November. It was the same motive when it came to creating new congressional districts for Republicans. This president is scared to death of what's going to happen when the American people finally get to say the last word on his policies. And so he wants to change the election rules. Hard to imagine. He's very blatant about it. They're not hiding it. The lead sponsor of the bill, the senior senator from Utah, said this weekend, and I quote, "Republicans will lose power likely for a long time if we don't get Save America passed. Unless we change the rules on registering and voting, even though there's little or no evidence of fraud and abuse, this Republican senator who's leading the charge concedes the obvious. It'll hurt them in the next election if they fail to pass this bill. They don't think they can win the election fair and square, so they need to change the rules and make it harder for eligible voters." So what's in this Republican political life raft that's on the floor? Among the provisions is one that requires all states to obtain proof of citizenship in person. 2 critical words, in person, from people looking to register to vote. In their bill, a driver's license, the most common form of identification in America, and most real IDs, would not be enough to register to vote. You need more. You've got to prove your citizenship before you can register under the Republican plan. Only birth certificates, passports, similar documentation would count. Well, let's go through those. How many Americans actually know where their original birth certificate can be found? And how about those who have a birth certificate with the maiden name of a woman who's married or in a hyphenated relationship? What are you going to do with those documents? And do you know how many Americans don't have a passport? Almost half of the people living in America have no passport. Half of the population. You say to yourself, well, go get a passport. There can't be much to it. Have you tried lately? You know what it costs? $165. So before you get to vote, you got to write a check for a passport for $165. That applies to 146 million Americans. And how long does it take? Well, I can tell you the people work hard to get out the millions of passports each year, but we're talking about 3 or 4 weeks, in some cases months. If you put an extra $60 on it, make it $225, they'll expedite it. That's your poll tax. You want to vote? You want to register? You got a passport? If you don't, get ready to fork over $165 to over $200 for a passport. And when you consider how long you have to wait, how long you have to wait for the opportunity to have this passport, maybe you're not doing it in time for this election. That's the Republican plan. Make it more bureaucratic and more cumbersome and more confusing, despite the fact there is little or no evidence of voter fraud in the United States. What this amounts to is a modern-day poll tax for a passport. This bill would also unfairly impact married women who've taken on their spouses' names. They either have to amend their original proof of citizenship documents or go through paperwork and a bureaucracy to register to vote. You're going to hear from my Republican colleagues about how this bill has been updated to accommodate people that don't have the required documentation. But the fact remains, unnecessary barriers are being put in place to block access to the ballot for no apparent reason. 77 cases of voter fraud in 24 years. Is that a national scandal? Is that a national crisis? Of course not. Here's the good news. At this moment, my Republican colleagues in the Senate don't have the votes to pass the bill. So now the question is, will the majority leader throw out the Senate rules and bend to the president's pressure? I certainly hope not. If we truly believe, as President Johnson said, that we must not refuse to protect the right of every American to vote in every election that we participate in, then we must reject this terrible legislation which will deny the right to vote to eligible voters across the United States. The Save America Act is an affront to the fundamental right to vote, and I'll be voting no. I yield the floor.